A blood pact with the devil. Caterina Esposito had spent her life preparing to be given away. A perfect daughter, a perfect wife. But before she could take her vows, she was dragged into the night by the one man her father had feared most. Enzo Costa smirked, his fingers curling possessively around her wrist. "You were never meant for him," he murmured. "And now I don't plan on giving you back." Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bride's Predicament. The silk of Caterina Esposito's wedding gown felt like a shroud against her skin. Ivory, the color of purity, of innocence, a cruel joke considering the circumstances. Outside the grand, antique-filled room of the Esposito villa, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the terracotta tiles in hues of fading gold and deepening amber. The air, thick with the scent of impending rain and the cloying sweetness of the hundreds of lilies arranged for the ceremony, felt heavy, suffocating. Caterina stared at her reflection in the ornate, gilded mirror, a stranger staring back. Her dark hair, usually a cascade of unruly waves, was tamed, pulled back into an intricate chignon that felt too tight, too restrictive. Her brown eyes, normally sparkling with a quiet defiance, were dull, shadowed with a resignation that had been creeping into her soul for months, ever since her father, Don Antonio Esposito, had announced her betrothal to Riccardo Bellini. Riccardo. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. He was old money, old power, a man who saw women as possessions, trophies to be displayed and controlled. Caterina had met him only a handful of times, each encounter leaving her feeling colder, more diminished. He was handsome, in a severe, almost cruel way, with sharp, predatory eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He spoke of her as one might speak of a prized horse, assessing her lineage, her beauty, her potential to bear strong sons. Cara, her mother, Isabella, said softly, entering the room. Isabella, a woman whose beauty had faded into a fragile elegance, her own spirit seemingly crushed under the weight of years spent navigating the treacherous currents of mafia life. She placed a delicate, blue-veined hand on Caterina's shoulder. The diamonds on Isabella's fingers, a gift from Antonio on their own arranged wedding day, glittered coldly. "You look radiant." Caterina managed a weak smile.
Doi, mame.
Isabella's eyes, a mirror of Caterina's own, filled with a sadness that went beyond the usual pre-wedding jitters. She knew. She understood the silent scream trapped within her daughter's chest. "It is for the good of the family, Caterina. You know this. The family. The Cosa Nostra. The invisible web that bound them all, a web woven with blood, loyalty, and fear." Caterina had been raised on stories of honor and tradition, of the sacred bonds that held their world together. But she had also seen the darkness, the casual cruelty that was accepted as the price of power. Her older brother, Marco, embraced it all, a loyal soldier to their father. But Caterina had always yearned for something more, something beyond the gilded cage of her existence. She thought of the small, worn book of poetry she kept hidden beneath her mattress, verses filled with longing for a life of freedom, of love freely given, not traded like a commodity. A foolish, childish dream, she knew. But it was the only thing that kept her spirit from completely breaking. "Riccardo is a powerful man," Isabella continued, her voice a strained whisper. "He will protect you. He will provide for you."
Protect? Provide?
Caterina wanted to laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. She didn't want protection, not the kind Riccardo offered. She wanted to be seen, to be valued for who she was, not for what she represented. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their tense silence. Marco, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "Papa is waiting. It's time." Caterina closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The scent of lilies suddenly seemed overwhelming, nauseating. She felt a tremor run through her, a primal instinct to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of her destiny. But she knew there was no escape. Not yet. She allowed Marco to lead her from the room, down the grand staircase, towards the sprawling gardens where the ceremony was to take place. The air was heavy with the threat of rain, the sky a bruised, ominous purple. Guests, a mixture of elegantly dressed family members and darkly clad men with watchful eyes, were already seated, their conversations a low, murmuring hum. As she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Marco's, Katerina felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching herself from a distance. She saw Ricardo standing at the altar, his face a mask of possessive satisfaction. She saw her father, Don Antonio, his face etched with a mixture of pride and steely determination. This union would solidify his power, secure his legacy. Katerina was merely a pawn in his game. The priest began the ceremony, his voice a droning monotone that seemed to blend with the growing rumble of thunder in the distance. Katerina barely heard the words, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a desperate, flickering hope for a miracle that would never come. Suddenly, a ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The murmuring ceased, replaced by a tense silence. Katerina felt Marco's grip tighten on her arm. A shadow fell over the gathering, a darkness that seemed to emanate from the edge of the gardens, where the manicured lawns met the wild, untamed woods beyond. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, his presence radiating a raw, untamed power that sent a shiver of both fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name, down Katerina's spine. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes, dark and intense, fixed solely on her. Infocosta. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper of danger, of forbidden allure. He was her father's greatest rival, a man spoken of in hushed tones, a legend shrouded in whispers of violence and unwavering determination. He was everything Ricardo was not: wild, untamed, a force of nature that defied the rigid rules of their world. He was the storm that had finally arrived, and Katerina felt it, in her soul. She wasn't sure what would become of her, but there was a fire, that was for sure. He was the one man who had her father looking as if he was to wed himself. He stopped directly in front of the altar, his gaze unwavering, a challenge in their depths. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the frantic beat of Katerina's heart. He looked at Ricardo, a flicker of disdain in his eyes, then back at Katerina. A slow, almost predatory smile curved his lips. "I believe," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very air, "this bride is already taken." The words hang in the air. Chapter 2. Snatched away into the shadows. Chaos erupted. The carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolved into a maelstrom of shouting, panicked movements, and the chilling scrape of chairs being overturned. Don Antonio, his face contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief, roared, "Costa, what is the meaning of this?" Enzo Costa ignored him, his focus remaining solely on Katerina. He moved with a swiftness that belied his size, closing the distance between them in a few long strides. Before anyone could react, before Ricardo could even utter a protest, Enzo's arm snaked around Katerina's waist, his grip possessive and undeniably strong. "You were never meant for him," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low, husky rumble that sent shivers down her spine. The scent of him, a blend of leather, expensive cologne, and something wilder, something untamed, filled her senses. "And now, I don't plan on giving you back." The words, spoken with such quiet certainty, such unwavering conviction, were both terrifying and exhilarating. Katerina, caught completely off guard, could only stare up at him, her mind struggling to process the sudden, violent shift in her reality. She was being abducted by her father's sworn enemy. At her own wedding, Ricardo, finally finding his voice, lunged forward, his face a mask of rage. "You dare?" He never finished the sentence. Two of Enzo's men, who had seemingly materialized from the shadows, intercepted him, their movements swift and brutal. One delivered a sharp blow to Ricardo's stomach, doubling him over, while the other pressed a gun to his temple, silencing him instantly. The sight of the weapon, the cold, hard reality of the violence that was unfolding around her, jolted Katerina out of her stunned paralysis. She tried to struggle, to pull away from Enzo's grip, but he held her fast. "Don't fight me, Kara," he whispered, his voice surprisingly gentle, despite the underlying steel. "It will only make things worse." She looked into his eyes, dark and intense, searching for any sign of what? Cruelty? Madness? She found neither. Instead, she saw a strange mixture of determination and something else, something that resonated deep within her, a flicker of something that almost looked like tenderness. "Let her go, Costa," Don Antonio bellowed, his voice hoarse with rage. His own men, hesitant and uncertain, began to move forward, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. Enzo didn't flinch. He held up a hand, a signal to his own men, who formed a protective wall around him and Katerina. "This is between me and the Esposito family, Antonio," he said, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "Leave your men out of it. This is not their fight. She is my daughter. My property." Antonio roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Enzo's smile was chilling. "She was never your property, Antonio. She is a woman, not a bargaining chip. And she is coming with me." He didn't wait for a response. With a swift, decisive movement, he pulled Katerina closer, his arm tightening around her waist, and began to move, backing away from the altar, towards the edge of the gardens, towards the darkness of the woods. Katerina, her mind reeling, felt a strange mix of terror and excitement. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was a sharp, unfamiliar sensation. She was being taken, kidnapped, yet a part of her, the part that had always yearned for freedom, for escape, felt a flicker of relief. The rain, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally began to fall, fat, heavy drops that splattered against the silk of her gown, soaking her hair, plastering it to her face. The scent of wet earth and the sound of the rain drumming against the leaves of the trees seemed to amplify the chaos, the sense of unreality. As they reached the edge of the woods, Enzo paused, turning to face Don Antonio one last time. "This is not over, Antonio," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is just the beginning." Then, with a final, possessive glance at Katerina, he plunged into the darkness, pulling her with him. The trees swallowed them whole, their branches reaching out like grasping claws, obscuring them from view. The sounds of the wedding, the shouts of anger and confusion, faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the frantic beat of Katerina's heart. She stumbled, her delicate shoes slipping on the wet leaves, but Enzo's grip never faltered. He held her close, his body a shield against the storm, against the unknown dangers that lay ahead. She had no idea where he was taking her, what his plans were, but one thing was certain. Her life, as she knew it, was over. And in its place, a terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly uncertain future had begun. The unknown scared her, but the freedom, even captive, was invigorating. She was no longer a pawn. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Forbidden Past. The journey was a blur. Katerina, soaked to the bone and shivering despite the warmth of Enzo's body pressed against hers, lost all sense of time and direction. They moved through the dense woods, Enzo navigating the treacherous terrain with an ease that spoke of long familiarity. The rain continued to fall, relentless and unforgiving, washing away the remnants of her former life, leaving her feeling raw, exposed, and utterly at the mercy of her captor. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat, choked by fear and a strange, unsettling awareness of the man who held her captive. His presence was overwhelming, a potent mix of danger and something else. Something that tugged at a long-dormant part of her, a yearning for something she couldn't quite define. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they emerged from the woods onto a narrow, winding road. A sleek, black car, its engine idling, waited for them, its headlights cutting through the gloom. One of Enzo's men, the one who had silenced Ricardo, stood beside the car, holding an umbrella. He opened the back door, his expression impassive. Enzo practically lifted Katerina into the car, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. The interior of the car was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The leather seats were soft and supple, and the air was subtly scented with the same cologne that clung to Enzo's skin. He slid in beside her, his body close, his thigh brushing against hers. Katerina instinctively recoiled, pressing herself against the door, trying to put as much distance between them as possible. Enzo watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Relax, Kara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I'm not going to hurt you." "You kidnapped me," she retorted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "You disrupted my wedding. You threatened my family." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Your wedding was a travesty. And your family, they are not exactly innocent, are they?" Katerina bristled. "They are my family. And they were selling you off like a prize heifer," he countered, his voice hardening.
You deserve better than that.
His words, spoken with such conviction, struck a chord within her. He saw her. He understood the silent desperation she had carried for so long. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, to be seen so clearly by a man who was supposed to be her enemy.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this?" He leaned back against the seat, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "Let's just say I had my reasons." The car began to move, smoothly and swiftly, gliding through the darkness. Katerina, exhausted and emotionally drained, found herself succumbing to a strange sense of not peace, exactly, but a kind of numb acceptance. She was a captive, yes, but she was also free from the suffocating expectations of her former life. As the miles passed, the rain gradually subsided, the storm giving way to a misty twilight. Katerina, her eyes heavy, drifted in and out of sleep, her head occasionally lolling against Enzo's shoulder. Each time, she would jerk awake, her heart pounding, only to find him watching her, his expression surprisingly gentle. Finally, the car slowed and turned onto a long, winding driveway, lined with ancient cypress trees. Through the mist, Katerina could make out the silhouette of a large villa, its stone walls illuminated by flickering lights. It was an imposing structure, old and grand, with a sense of history and secrets. The car came to a stop in front of a massive, arched doorway. Enzo got out and opened the door for her, extending his hand. Katerina hesitated, her gaze flickering between his outstretched hand and the imposing villa. This was his world, a world she knew nothing about. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Home," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Or at least, it will be for now." He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, and helped her out of the car. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of the sea and the faint aroma of wood smoke. As they walked towards the villa, Katerina felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She had never been here before, she was certain of it, yet something about the place felt familiar. Inside, the villa was a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors and grand, echoing rooms. Antique furniture, heavy with intricate carvings, lined the walls. Paintings, portraits of stern-faced men and women in elaborate clothing, stared down at her, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something else, something indefinable, a lingering trace of sadness. Enzo led her to a large, opulent bedroom. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. A four-poster bed, draped with heavy velvet curtains, dominated the space. "You should rest," Enzo said, his voice softer now, almost caring. "You've had a long day." Katerina nodded, her mind still reeling. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She wanted nothing more than to collapse onto the bed and sleep for a week. He gestured towards a doorway. "There's a bathroom through there. You'll find everything you need." He turned to leave, but then paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked back at her, his dark eyes searching hers. Katerina, he said, his voice low and hesitant. I know this is not what you expected, but I promise you I will not let any harm come to you. The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, surprised her. She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. But for the first time since she had been snatched away from her wedding, she felt a flicker of hope. A tiny, fragile spark in the darkness. A long-held secret about her mother's family started to feel like it might soon see the light of day after all these years. Something she had always been told to never speak of and to never ask about. Chapter 4. The Lion's Den Unveiled. The bathroom was a sanctuary of marble and soft light. Katerina shed her sodden wedding dress, the silk now heavy and clinging, a symbol of the life she had left behind. She stepped into the large, claw-footed tub, filled with steaming water scented with lavender and rosemary. The warmth enveloped her, easing the aches in her muscles, soothing the rawness of her skin. As she soaked, her mind replayed the events of the day, the whirlwind of emotions, the terrifying yet strangely exhilarating feeling of being swept away by Enzo Costa. He was a paradox, a man of violence, and yet capable of surprising gentleness. His words echoed in her mind. You deserve better than that. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the water seep into her bones. She thought of her mother, Isabella, and the sadness that always seemed to cling to her, a sadness that Katerina now suspected was connected to the secrets surrounding her own family history. The whispered conversations, the hushed tones whenever the name Costa was mentioned, the way her father would always shut down any questions about her mother's past. Katerina had always sensed there was something more, a hidden story that had been carefully buried, kept from her for her entire life. And now, here she was, a prisoner in the home of her father's greatest enemy, a man who, she suspected, held the key to unlocking those secrets. After her bath, she found a soft, silk robe laid out for her, along with a pair of slippers. The robe was a deep emerald green, a color that brought out the hidden depths in her brown eyes. She slipped it on, the fabric feeling luxurious against her skin. She emerged from the bathroom, feeling refreshed but also apprehensive. The bedroom was empty, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. A small table had been set near the hearth, laden with food. A bowl of steaming pasta, crusty bread, a plate of cheese and fruit, and a bottle of wine. Katerina hesitated, unsure whether she should eat. Was it poisoned? A foolish thought, she realized. If Enzo wanted her dead, he could have killed her already. She was hungry, ravenously so, and the aroma of the food was too tempting to resist. She sat down at the table and began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing appetite. The pasta was delicious, a simple but flavorful dish of tomatoes, garlic, and basil. The wine, a deep, ruby red, warmed her from the inside out. As she ate, she studied the room, taking in the details. The furniture was antique, but well cared for. The walls were adorned with paintings, mostly landscapes and portraits. One painting in particular caught her eye. It was a portrait of a young woman, with dark hair and striking brown eyes that were almost identical to her own. The woman wore a dress similar in style to the one Katerina had worn for her wedding, but the color was a deep, vibrant blue. There was a sadness in the woman's eyes, a haunting quality that resonated with Katerina. She was still staring at the painting when Enzo entered the room. He had changed out of his wet clothes and was now wearing a dark cashmere sweater and trousers. He looked less imposing, more approachable. I see you found the food, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Katerina nodded, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. It was delicious. Thank you. He sat down in the chair opposite her, pouring himself a glass of wine. You looked like you needed it. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Katerina felt a strange sense of comfort, sitting there with him, despite the circumstances. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain, a connection that defied logic. That painting, she said, gesturing towards the portrait of the young woman. Who is she? Enzo's expression changed, a shadow passing over his face. That is my mother, he said, his voice low and laced with a hint of sadness. Katerina's eyes widened. She looked at the painting again, studying the woman's features. The resemblance was undeniable. She looked like Katerina. She looks like me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Enzo nodded. She does. He took a sip of his wine, his gaze fixed on the painting. She died when I was young, he said, his voice tight with emotion.
She was taken from me.
Katerina felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose a loved one, to feel the gaping hole that their absence left in your life. Although her mother was alive, the absence was felt all the same.
I'm sorry, she said softly.
He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. Your father, he knows the truth about what happened to her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He knows who was responsible. Katerina's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The secret she had sensed for so long, the hidden story that had been kept from her. What happened? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Enzo hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and the painting.
It's a long story, he said.
A story filled with betrayal and pain. He took a deep breath, then began to speak, his voice low and measured. He told her of a time long ago when the Esposito and Costa families were not enemies, but allies, bound together by a shared history, a shared code. He spoke of her grandmother, a woman named Isabella, just like her mother, a woman who had been betrothed to his father, a man named Lorenzo Costa. He spoke of a forbidden love, a secret affair between Isabella and Antonio Esposito, Katerina's father. A love that had shattered the alliance between the two families, a love that had led to tragedy. Katerina sat in stunned silence. That night, she found it difficult to sleep. The truth was revealed, and it shook her to her core. Chapter 5. Whispers of Rebellion and Desire. Katerina listened, rapt, as Enzo unfolded the story of their family's intertwined past. Isabella, her grandmother, had been deeply in love with Lorenzo Costa, Enzo's father. Their betrothal was a symbol of the strong bond between the two families, a promise of future unity. But Antonio Esposito, young, ambitious, and driven by a possessive desire, had seduced Isabella, playing on her vulnerabilities, whispering promises he never intended to keep. Isabella, torn between her duty to her family and her forbidden love for Antonio, had made a choice. She had broken off her engagement with Lorenzo, causing a rift between the families that had never healed. Lorenzo, heartbroken and consumed by a sense of betrayal, had vowed revenge. But that's not all, Enzo said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There's more. Something your father has never told you, something he has kept hidden for all these years. He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and pain. My mother, she didn't just die. She was murdered. And Antonio, he was involved. Katerina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room seemed to spin around her. Her father a murderer? It was impossible, unthinkable. Yet, deep down, a part of her, the part that had always sensed the darkness beneath his polished exterior, knew it was true. How do you know? She asked, her voice trembling. Enzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to her. It was a picture of his mother, the woman in the painting, standing next to a man. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but Katerina recognized the distinctive set of his jaw, the cold, hard glint in his eye. It was her father, Antonio, younger, but unmistakably him. This was found among my mother's belongings, Enzo said, his voice tight with emotion. There was a note on the back. A threat. From your father. Katerina stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. The evidence was undeniable. Her father, the man she had always looked up to, the man who had preached about honor and family loyalty, was a liar, a betrayer, a murderer. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt betrayed, disgusted, and strangely liberated. The carefully constructed world she had known, the world of lies and deception, was crumbling around her. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice choked with emotion. Enzo reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice soft.
"I know this is a lot to take in."
His touch sent a shiver through her, a strange mix of fear and something else. A warmth that spread through her veins, a forbidden spark of attraction. She looked into his eyes, dark and intense, and saw not the monster she had expected, but a man who had been deeply wounded, a man who was seeking justice, not just revenge. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Why didn't you just go to the authorities?" He smiled, a sad, almost wistful smile. "The authorities? In our world, Katerina, there is no such thing as justice. Only power. And your father, he has a lot of power." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I brought you here because I need your help." Katerina's eyes widened. "My help? What can I possibly do?" "You know your father," he said. "You know his weaknesses, his secrets. You can help me bring him down." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. To betray her own father, to align herself with his enemy, it was unthinkable. Yet, the idea of finally exposing the truth, of bringing justice to Enzo's mother, of breaking free from the suffocating grip of her family's legacy, it was also incredibly tempting. She hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Loyalty versus truth. Family versus justice. Fear versus desire. The attraction she felt for Enzo was undeniable, a forbidden flame that had been ignited the moment he had swept her away from her wedding. It was a dangerous, reckless feeling, but it was also intoxicating. I don't know," she said, her voice uncertain. "I need time to think." Enzo nodded, understanding. "I know this is a lot to ask," he said, "but I believe together we can do this. We can finally bring the truth to light." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the misty landscape.
"Sleep on it," he said.
"We'll talk more in the morning." He left the room, leaving Katerina alone with her thoughts, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and a growing, undeniable desire for the man who had stolen her away. The rain had stopped completely, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light over the room. She was trapped, but also strangely free. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, but for the first time in her life, Katerina felt a sense of purpose. A purpose that went beyond the expectations of her family, a purpose that was driven by her own conscience, her own sense of justice. And, perhaps, by a forbidden love that was beginning to blossom in the most unexpected of places. She was scared, but ready. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Surface. The morning light, filtered through the heavy curtains, painted the room in soft hues of gold and rose. Katerina woke slowly, her mind still grappling with the revelations of the previous night. The weight of her family's past, the truth about her father's involvement in Enzo's mother's death, pressed down on her, a heavy burden of guilt and shame. She rose from the bed, the silk robe feeling cool against her skin. She walked over to the window, drawing back the curtains, and gazed out at the view. The villa was perched on a hillside, overlooking a rugged coastline. The sea, a deep, shimmering blue, stretched out to the horizon, its vastness both calming and daunting. She thought of Enzo, of the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his hardened exterior, of the pain that had driven him to seek justice for his mother. She thought of the forbidden attraction she felt for him, a dangerous, reckless feeling that she knew she should resist, but couldn't quite deny. She dressed in clothes that had been laid out for her, a simple, but elegant, pair of trousers and a soft, cashmere sweater. The clothes fit perfectly, as if they had been made for her. Another small detail that made her begin to wonder. As she left the bedroom, she heard voices coming from downstairs, a low murmur of conversation. She followed the sound, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She found Enzo in a large, sun-drenched study, sitting at a massive, antique desk, talking to one of his men. The man, tall and muscular, with a scar that ran across his left cheek, was speaking in rapid Italian, his voice urgent. Enzo saw her standing in the doorway and gestured for her to come in. He dismissed the man with a nod, then turned his attention to Katerina. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm, his eyes searching hers.
Did you sleep well?
"As well as could be expected," she replied, her voice neutral. He smiled, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "I imagine you have a lot on your mind." She nodded, taking a seat in a chair opposite his desk. "I do." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Katerina felt a strange sense of intimacy, sitting there with him, despite the circumstances. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain, a connection that defied logic. "Have you thought about what I asked you?" he said, his voice hesitant. Katerina took a deep breath. She had spent most of the night wrestling with her conscience, weighing her loyalty to her family against her growing sense of justice, her desire to help Enzo. "I have," she said, her voice firm. "And I'll do it. I'll help you." Enzo's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, and then relief, washing over his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I know this is not easy for you." "It's not," she agreed. "But it's the right thing to do." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We need to be careful," he said. "Your father is a dangerous man. He has eyes and ears everywhere." Katerina nodded, understanding the risks involved.
What do you need me to do?
He explained his plan, a carefully orchestrated strategy to expose her father's crimes, to gather evidence that would bring him down. He needed her to access information, to uncover secrets that were hidden within the Esposito family, secrets that only she could access.
It won't be easy, he said.
And it will be dangerous. But I promise you I will protect you. His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver through her. She trusted him, she realized. Despite everything, despite the fact that he was her captor, she trusted him. As they talked, Katerina began to see a different side of Enzo, a side that went beyond the ruthless mafia boss, the man who had stolen her away from her wedding. She saw the intelligence, the strategic mind, the unwavering determination to seek justice for his mother. She also saw the vulnerability, the pain that he carried beneath his hardened exterior, the scars of a past that had shaped him into the man he was today. He told her more about his childhood, about the loss of his mother, about the years he had spent planning his revenge, building his own power, waiting for the right moment to strike. He spoke of his loyalty to his men, of the code of honor that governed his life, a code that was far more complex, far more nuanced, than the simplistic image of the ruthless mafia boss. Katerina, in turn, began to share her own experiences, her own feelings of being trapped, of being a pawn in her father's games. She spoke of her yearning for freedom, for a life beyond the suffocating expectations of her family, of her dreams of finding a love that was true, that was not based on power or obligation. As they talked, the barriers between them began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of understanding, of shared pain, of a forbidden connection that was undeniable. The attraction she felt for him was no longer just a physical thing, it was something deeper, something that resonated with her soul. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the study, Katerina felt a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, that she had never felt before. She was still a captive, yes, but she was also a partner, an ally in a dangerous game. And she was falling in love with the one man that made sense. Chapter 7. A glimmer of unexpected trust. The days that followed settled into a strange, almost surreal routine. Katerina, no longer confined to her room, began to explore the villa and its surroundings. The villa, she discovered, was a treasure trove of history, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and hidden passages. It was a world unto itself, a refuge from the chaos and violence of the outside world. She spent hours in the library, poring over old books and documents, searching for any clues that might help Enzo in his quest to expose her father's crimes. She discovered a hidden room behind a bookcase, a secret chamber filled with old ledgers and correspondence, detailing the Esposito family's illicit dealings over the decades. She also spent time with Enzo, their conversations ranging from the strategic planning of their next moves to more personal, Intimate discussions about their lives, their hopes, their fears. She learned more about his past, about the challenges he had faced, the sacrifices he had made to build his own empire, to stand up to her father. He, in turn, listened with genuine interest as she spoke of her own dreams, her own aspirations, her longing for a life beyond the confines of her family's expectations. He encouraged her to pursue her passions, to embrace her intelligence, her creativity, her quiet strength. The attraction between them grew stronger with each passing day, a palpable tension that hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. They would often find themselves lingering in each other's presence, their eyes meeting, their hands brushing accidentally, sending shivers of electricity through their bodies. One evening, they found themselves standing on the terrace, overlooking the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of the sea and the fragrant blossoms of the nearby gardens. "It's beautiful," Katerina said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Enzo nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "Not as beautiful as you," he said, his voice low and husky. She blushed, her heart fluttering in her chest. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Enzo," he reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was electric, sending a wave of heat through her body. "Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know this is complicated, but he hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of desire and uncertainty. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should pull away, that this was wrong, dangerous, but she couldn't resist. She wanted him, more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. He kissed her, gently at first, then with increasing passion. His lips were soft and warm, his touch sending a wave of desire through her body. She responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss was a revelation, a release of all the pent-up emotions, the fear, the uncertainty, the forbidden attraction that had been building between them. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a connection that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries of their family's feud. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding. They stared at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of passion and disbelief. Enzo began, his voice hesitant. "Don't," Katerina said, placing a finger on his lips. "Don't say anything." She knew that words would only complicate things, that they couldn't deny the reality of their situation, the danger that surrounded them. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the connection they shared, the undeniable spark of love that had ignited between them. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the last rays of the sun disappear below the horizon. The silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding, with a shared sense of hope. The glimmer was felt in the air. But as the moon rose, casting its pale light over the villa, Katerina knew that their moment of peace was fleeting. The reality of their situation, the danger that lurked around every corner, would soon intrude. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the moment, to bask in the warmth of Enzo's embrace, to dream of a future that might be, a future where their love could overcome the darkness that surrounded them. The reality of her father's actions loomed. Chapter 8. The tightrope of loyalty and betrayal. The fragile peace shattered the next morning. A coded message, intercepted by one of Enzo's men, revealed that Don Antonio was planning a move. He was aware that Katerina was with Enzo, and he was not pleased. He was mobilizing his forces, preparing to strike. Enzo and Katerina were in the study, reviewing the information Katerina had gathered from the hidden room in the library, when the news arrived. Enzo's face hardened, his eyes turning cold and calculating. "He's coming for you," he said, his voice grim. "He won't let you go easily." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her father was ruthless, that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But she also knew that she couldn't go back. She couldn't return to the life she had left behind, to the suffocating control of her family. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice firm. "I'm staying here. With you." Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It's dangerous, Katerina," he said. "He will not hesitate to hurt you, to use you against me." "I know," she said. "But I'm not afraid. Not anymore." She had made her choice. She had chosen love over loyalty, justice over family. She had chosen Enzo. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll face him together," he said. "We'll be ready for him." They spent the rest of the day preparing, fortifying the villa, gathering their forces. Enzo's men, loyal and disciplined, moved with a quiet efficiency, transforming the villa into a fortress. Katerina, despite her lack of experience in such matters, found herself drawn into the preparations. She helped Enzo review the security plans, offering suggestions based on her knowledge of her father's tactics, his weaknesses. As they worked, the tension between them, the unspoken passion that had simmered beneath the surface, flared up again. They would often find themselves exchanging glances, their eyes lingering, their hands brushing accidentally, sending shivers of electricity through their bodies. But they knew they couldn't afford to be distracted. They had to focus on the task at hand, on the impending confrontation with her father. Late that evening, Enzo called a meeting of his closest advisors, including Katerina. They gathered in the war room, a large, dimly lit chamber filled with maps, charts, and communication equipment. Enzo outlined his strategy, a plan to defend the villa, to repel her father's attack. He spoke with confidence and authority, his words inspiring his men, reassuring Katerina. But as the meeting progressed, Katerina noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. There was a tension in the room, a sense of unease that she couldn't quite place. She saw glances exchanged between some of Enzo's men, whispers that ceased abruptly when she approached. She sensed a betrayal, a hidden undercurrent of disloyalty that threatened to undermine their efforts. She didn't know who to trust, who to suspect. She tried to raise her concerns with Enzo, but he dismissed them, assuring her that his men were loyal, that they would never betray him. "You're imagining things, Kara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're under a lot of stress." But Katerina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had grown up in a world of secrets and lies, of hidden agendas and betrayals. She knew the signs, the subtle cues that indicated something was amiss. As the night wore on, her unease grew stronger. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, balanced precariously between loyalty and betrayal, between love and danger. She knew that the coming confrontation with her father would be a test, not just of their strength, but of their trust in each other. And she feared that the greatest threat might not come from outside the villa, but from within. She began to second-guess every face she saw, trying to work out where the betrayal would stem from. Chapter 9. Shadows of the Past Converge. The storm broke just before dawn. Not a meteorological storm, but a storm of violence, of long-simmering hatred and vengeance. Don Antonio's men attacked the villa, their assault swift and brutal, a coordinated effort designed to overwhelm Enzo's defenses. Katerina, awakened by the sound of gunfire and shouting, found herself thrust into the heart of the chaos. Enzo, his face grim and determined, had armed her with a small pistol, instructing her to stay hidden, to protect herself. But Katerina refused to cower in fear. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stand with Enzo, and she would not abandon him now. She moved through the villa, her senses on high alert, navigating the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the pockets of fighting. She saw Enzo's men, fighting fiercely, defending their territory, their loyalty to their leader unwavering. But she also saw signs of the betrayal she had feared. Some of Enzo's men, their faces masked, were deliberately creating openings in the defenses, allowing her father's men to infiltrate the villa. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that the traitor was someone close to Enzo, someone he trusted implicitly. She suspected Marco, her own brother, had something to do with the information being leaked, but could not prove it. Yet. She found Enzo in the war room, directing the defense, his voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos raging around him. He was surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants, including a man named Silvio, a man who had been with Enzo for years, a man who had always seemed the epitome of loyalty. Caterina saw the look in Silvio's eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't loyalty, something that was closer to triumph. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Silvio was the traitor. She tried to warn Enzo, but it was too late. Silvio, moving with a swiftness that belied his age, drew a knife and lunged at Enzo, his intent clear, to kill his leader, to deliver the villa and Caterina to her father. Enzo, caught off guard, barely managed to deflect the blow, the knife grazing his arm, drawing blood. He staggered back, his face contorted in pain and surprise. Caterina reacted without thinking. She raised her pistol, her hand trembling, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the war room. Silvio crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The room fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of Enzo and Caterina. Enzo's men stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, and something else. Something that looked like love. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. Caterina nodded, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline surge. "I told you, I wouldn't let him hurt you." The fighting continued, but the tide had turned. With Silvio's betrayal exposed, Enzo's men rallied, their loyalty renewed, their determination strengthened. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even Caterina, pushing back her father's men, driving them from the villa. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, golden light over the battered villa, the fighting subsided. Don Antonio's attack had failed. He had been forced to retreat, his forces decimated, his plans thwarted. Enzo, his arm bandaged, stood on the terrace, overlooking the scene of the battle. Caterina stood beside him, her hand in his. They were both exhausted, emotionally drained, but they were alive. And they were together. "It's not over," Enzo said, his voice grim. "He'll be back. He won't give up easily." Caterina nodded, knowing he was right. But she also knew that they had won a victory, a significant victory. They had faced the storm, and they had survived. And they had done it together. The shadows of the past had converged, bringing violence and betrayal, but they had also brought something else, a confirmation of their love, a strengthening of their bond, a glimmer of hope for a future free from the darkness of their family's feud. But the wind felt hollow. Caterina knew this was far from over. Chapter 10. Unmasking Hidden Truths. The immediate aftermath of the attack was a blur of activity. Enzo's men tended to the wounded, secured the villa, and began the grim task of clearing away the debris. Caterina, despite her exhaustion, insisted on helping, her presence a source of comfort and reassurance to the injured. Enzo, his arm throbbing with pain, refused to rest. He interrogated the captured men, seeking information about her father's plans, his network of allies. He was determined to uncover the full extent of the betrayal, to root out any remaining traitors within his ranks. Caterina, meanwhile, focused on Silvio. She searched his belongings, looking for any evidence that might shed light on his motives, his connections to her father. She found a hidden compartment in his desk, containing a stack of letters, written in her father's distinctive hand. The letters revealed a long-standing conspiracy, a secret alliance between Silvio and Don Antonio that stretched back years. Silvio had been feeding information to her father, sabotaging Enzo's operations, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The letters also revealed something else, something that sent a chill down Caterina's spine. Silvio had not been acting alone. He had been working with someone else, someone within the Esposito family, someone who had been providing him with inside information, someone who had betrayed not only Enzo, but Caterina herself. The letters didn't explicitly name the person, but they contained clues, subtle hints that pointed in one direction. Marco, her own brother. Katerina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Marco, the brother she had always looked up to, the brother who had always seemed so loyal, so devoted to the family, a traitor? It was almost impossible to believe. Yet the evidence was undeniable. She confronted Enzo with her findings, her voice trembling with emotion. He listened in silence, his face a mask of grim determination. He had suspected Marco, but he had hoped he was wrong. "We need proof," he said, his voice low and controlled. "We need something concrete to expose him." They decided to set a trap, to lure Marco into revealing his treachery. They crafted a false message, a coded communication that indicated Enzo was planning a major move, a move that would leave him vulnerable to attack. They sent the message through a channel they knew Marco was monitoring, waiting for him to take the bait. The waiting was agonizing. Katerina felt torn, her loyalty to her brother warring with her love for Enzo, her commitment to justice. She hoped, desperately, that she was wrong, that Marco was innocent. But her hopes were dashed. Within hours, they received confirmation that Marco had passed the information to their father. Don Antonio was mobilizing his forces again, preparing for another attack, an attack that he believed would be a decisive victory. Enzo and Katerina confronted Marco, presenting him with the evidence of his betrayal. Marco, his face pale and drawn, initially denied everything. But as they presented him with the letters, the coded messages, the undeniable proof of his treachery, he broke down, confessing everything. He admitted to working with Silvio, to feeding information to their father, to betraying Enzo and Katerina. He claimed he had done it for the good of the family, to protect their father's legacy, to ensure the Esposito's continued dominance. Katerina listened in stunned silence, her heart breaking with each word. Her brother, the man she had always trusted, had betrayed her in the most profound way possible. Enzo, his face a mask of cold fury, ordered Marco to be imprisoned, to await his judgment. As Marco was led away, he looked at Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and pleading. Katerina turned away, unable to bear the sight of her brother's betrayal. She felt a deep, aching sadness, a sense of loss that was almost unbearable. She had lost her brother, not to death, but to something far worse, the darkness that had consumed their family for generations. She had to hold strong with Enzo. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The days following Marco's imprisonment were heavy with a somber atmosphere. The villa, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on Katerina. She mourned the loss of her brother, the shattering of the illusion of family unity, the realization that the darkness she had sought to escape had followed her even here. Enzo, despite his own internal turmoil, tried to comfort her. He understood her pain, her sense of betrayal, her grief. He held her, whispered words of reassurance, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. But Katerina found it difficult to find solace. She felt guilty, responsible for her brother's fate, even though she knew she had done the right thing. She questioned her choices, her loyalties, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. One evening, she found herself wandering through the villa, drawn to the hidden room behind the library, the room where she had discovered the secrets of her family's past. She sat among the old ledgers and correspondence, the ghosts of her ancestors seeming to whisper around her. She came across a small, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. It was her grandmother's diary, Isabella's, the woman who had been at the center of the feud between the Esposito and Costa families. Katerina began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. Isabella's words, written in elegant script, brought the past to life, revealing the truth behind the carefully constructed lies that had been passed down through generations. Isabella had not been a willing participant in her father's schemes. She had truly loved Lorenzo Costa, Enzo's father. She had been forced to betray him, to marry Antonio, under threat of violence, of harm to her family. Antonio had manipulated her, controlled her, using her as a pawn in his quest for power. He had even been responsible for Lorenzo's death, framing him for a crime he didn't commit, ensuring that he would never be a threat again. Caterina read on, tears streaming down her face. The truth was far more complex, far more tragic than she had ever imagined. Her father was not just a ruthless mafia boss. He was a monster, a man who had destroyed the lives of everyone around him, including his own wife, his own daughter. The diary also revealed something else, something that made Caterina gasp. Isabella had been pregnant when she married Antonio. The child, a son, had been taken from her at birth, given to another family to raise, to protect him from Antonio's wrath. The son was Enzo. Caterina felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Enzo, the man she loved, was not just her father's enemy. He was her half-brother. The revelation was shocking, devastating. It changed everything. Their love, their forbidden passion, was now incestuous, a transgression against the natural order, a sin. She didn't know what to do, how to process this information. She felt sick, disgusted, and heartbroken. The future she had dreamed of, the future with Enzo, was now impossible, a shattered illusion. She closed the diary, her hands trembling. She had to tell Enzo. She had to reveal the truth, no matter how painful it might be.
But she didn't know how.
She feared his reaction, his rejection, his disgust. She stumbled out of the hidden room, her mind reeling, her heart breaking. She found Enzo in the study, working late into the night. He looked up as she entered, his eyes filled with concern. "Caterina," he said, his voice soft. "What's wrong?" She couldn't speak, the words caught in her throat. She simply handed him the diary, her hand shaking uncontrollably. He took the diary, his brow furrowed in confusion. He began to read, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression changing from confusion to shock, to disbelief, to horror. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. This can't be true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Caterina could only nod, tears streaming down her face. The truth was out, and their world had shattered. The price was steep. Chapter 12. A Dance with Danger. The revelation of their true relationship cast a long, dark shadow over Enzo and Caterina. The easy intimacy, the passionate connection they had shared, was replaced by a strained awkwardness, a painful awareness of the forbidden nature of their love. They avoided each other, unable to bear the weight of the truth, the impossibility of their situation. They moved through the villa like ghosts, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their eyes filled with a shared grief. Enzo, consumed by a mixture of shock and self-loathing, threw himself into his work, focusing on the upcoming confrontation with Don Antonio. He knew that her father would not rest until he had Caterina back, until he had crushed Enzo and his entire operation. Caterina, meanwhile, retreated into herself, spending hours in her room, staring out at the sea, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and despair. She felt lost, adrift, her future uncertain, her heart broken. But despite the pain, despite the forbidden nature of their relationship, they couldn't deny the connection they shared, the deep, abiding love that had blossomed between them. They were drawn to each other, pulled by an invisible force that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries of their family ties. One evening, they found themselves drawn to the terrace, the place where they had shared their first kiss, the place where their love had first ignited. The moon was full, casting a pale, ethereal light over the sea. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of the nearby gardens. They stood in silence for a long time, avoiding each other's gaze, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Enzo spoke, his voice low and strained. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice raw with emotion. I can't stop loving you." Caterina turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I feel the same way." They looked at each other, their eyes searching, their hearts aching. The love they shared was undeniable, a powerful force that had survived betrayal, violence, and now this. Enzo reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was electric, sending a wave of heat through her body, despite the chilling knowledge of their true relationship. "We can't," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can't be together. It's wrong." Katerina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she said. "But I don't know how to stop loving you." They stood there, caught in a web of forbidden desire, of a love that was both beautiful and tragic. They knew they should walk away, that they should sever the connection between them, but they couldn't. Enzo pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, his body pressing against hers. He kissed her, gently at first, then with increasing passion, a desperate attempt to hold onto the love that was slipping away from them. Katerina responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body molding to his. The kiss was filled with a bittersweet longing, a poignant farewell to the future they could never have. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding. They stared at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of passion and despair. "We can't keep doing this," Enzo said, his voice ragged. "It will only lead to more pain." Katerina nodded, knowing he was right. But the thought of being without him, of severing the connection between them, was almost unbearable. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Enzo didn't answer. He simply held her close, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. They stood there, locked in a desperate embrace, two souls caught in a dance with danger, a dance with a forbidden love that threatened to consume them both. They couldn't deny what they knew to be true, but the future was bleak. Chapter 13. Cracks in the Foundation. The uneasy truce between Enzo and Katerina, born of shared grief and forbidden love, began to fray. The weight of their secret, the knowledge of their true relationship, pressed down on them, creating a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. They continued to work together, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Don Antonio, but the easy camaraderie, the shared sense of purpose, was gone. Their conversations were strained, their interactions formal, their eyes avoiding each other's gaze. Enzo, consumed by guilt and self-loathing, became increasingly withdrawn, isolating himself in his work, pushing Katerina away. He couldn't bear to be near her, to feel the pull of the forbidden attraction that still simmered between them. Katerina, meanwhile, felt increasingly alone, abandoned by the one person who had understood her, who had shared her pain, who had loved her. She tried to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but he rebuffed her efforts, his walls firmly in place. The tension within the villa was palpable, affecting everyone. Enzo's men, sensing the shift in their leader's demeanor, became uneasy, uncertain. The loyalty that had been so strong, so unwavering, began to crack, eroded by the unspoken tension, the growing sense of unease. Katerina noticed the change, the subtle signs of doubt, of questioning, in the eyes of Enzo's men. She feared that their internal conflict, their personal struggles, would weaken them, making them vulnerable to her father's attack. She tried to warn Enzo, but he dismissed her concerns, his mind focused solely on the upcoming battle. He was determined to defeat her father, to end the feud once and for all, even if it meant sacrificing everything, including his own happiness, his own sanity. One evening, Katerina found Enzo in the study, poring over maps and battle plans, his face etched with exhaustion and determination. She approached him cautiously, her heart aching for the connection they had lost. "Enzo," she said softly, "we need to talk." He didn't look up, his focus remaining on the maps. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice cold and distant. "Yes, there is," she insisted. "We can't go on like this. We're tearing ourselves apart." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "What do you want me to say, Katerina?" he said, his voice raw with emotion. "That I don't love you? That I don't feel this agonizing pull towards you? I can't. I won't lie to you."
"I don't want you to lie," she said. I need you to talk to me.
"To share what you're feeling." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression weary.
"I feel lost," he said.
I feel like I'm drowning in guilt, in self-loathing. I love you, Katerina, but I can't be with you. It's wrong. It's forbidden. I know, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. But we can't just pretend that our feelings don't exist. We can't just ignore the connection we share. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the dark landscape. Maybe we should have never met, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe it would have been better if I had left you at that wedding, if I had never brought you into this world. His words cut her to the core. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. Was he right? Was their love a mistake, a curse that had brought them nothing but pain? Don't say that, she said, her voice trembling. Don't say that you regret meeting me. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions: love, guilt, despair. I don't regret meeting you, Katerina, he said. But I don't know how to live with this. I don't know how to be with you, knowing what we are. They stood there, locked in a silent battle of emotions, the chasm between them widening with each passing moment. The foundation of their relationship, built on forbidden love and shared secrets, was crumbling, threatening to collapse under the weight of their impossible situation. Their situation was cracking the core. Chapter 14. The weight of unspoken words. The silence between Enzo and Katerina stretched, becoming a heavy, suffocating presence in the villa. They moved around each other like strangers, their interactions brief and formal, their eyes avoiding contact. The unspoken words, the unresolved emotions, hung in the air, a constant reminder of the forbidden nature of their love. Enzo buried himself in preparations for the impending attack, working tirelessly, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion. He was driven by a desperate need to protect Katerina, to defeat her father, to somehow atone for the sin of their relationship. Katerina, meanwhile, felt increasingly isolated, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and despair. She tried to focus on helping with the preparations, on gathering information, on offering support to Enzo's men, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt like an outsider, a stranger in a world she had once thought she belonged to. One afternoon, she found herself in the gardens, seeking solace in the beauty of the natural world. She sat by a small fountain, its gentle splashing the only sound breaking the silence. She closed her eyes, trying to find some semblance of peace, some escape from the turmoil within her. She thought of her mother, Isabella, and the sadness that had always clung to her, a sadness that Katerina now understood. She thought of her grandmother, also named Isabella, and the tragic love story that had shaped her life, that had led to the feud between the Esposito and Costa families. She wondered if history was repeating itself, if she and Enzo were destined to follow the same tragic path as their ancestors. Was their love cursed, doomed to failure, a victim of the sins of the past? As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard a noise, a subtle rustling in the bushes nearby. She opened her eyes, her senses on high alert. She saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a man she recognized instantly, her father, Don Antonio. He approached her cautiously, his face a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked like regret? Katerina, he said, his voice low and strained. We need to talk. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She was unarmed, alone, vulnerable. But she refused to show fear. What do you want? She asked, her voice cold and defiant. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I want you to come home, he said. I want this madness to end. Come home? She repeated, her voice incredulous. After everything you've done? After you murdered Enzo's father? After you tried to kill Enzo? That was a mistake, he said, his voice pleading. I was misguided. I let my anger, my hatred control me. And what about Marco? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. What about your own son? You used him, betrayed him, just like you betrayed everyone else. He flinched, his eyes filling with a flicker of pain. Marco made his own choices, he said. He chose to side with me, to follow in my footsteps. He chose to be loyal to his family, she corrected him. And you rewarded that loyalty with betrayal. They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, the weight of unspoken words, of years of lies and deception, hanging heavy between them. I know I've made mistakes, Katerina, he said, his voice softening. But I'm your father. I love you. I want to protect you.
Protect me?
She repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. You want to control me. You want to use me, just like you used my mother, just like you used everyone else. He stepped closer, reaching out to her, his hand trembling. Please, Katerina, he said.
Come home.
We can put this behind us. We can start again. She recoiled from his touch, her eyes filled with disgust. I will never come home, she said, her voice firm and resolute. I will never forgive you for what you've done. His face hardened, his eyes turning cold. You leave me no choice then, he said, his voice a low growl. If you won't come willingly, I will take you by force. He lunged at her, his intention clear, to kidnap her, to drag her back to the life she had escaped. But before he could reach her, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that moved with swiftness and deadly grace. Enzo. He intercepted her father, his body a shield between Katerina and the man who sought to harm her. A fierce struggle ensued, a brutal clash between two men driven by hatred and a desperate need to protect the woman they both loved, in their own twisted ways. The culmination of all of this was coming. Chapter 15. Embracing the Forbidden Flame. The fight between Enzo and Don Antonio was swift and brutal, a whirlwind of fists, kicks, and desperate grapples. Enzo, fueled by a mixture of rage and a fierce need to protect Katerina, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. Don Antonio, older but still strong and ruthless, fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. Katerina watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to intervene, to help Enzo, but she knew she would only be a hindrance. She could only watch and pray that Enzo would survive. The fight moved from the gardens into the villa, the sound of their struggle echoing through the silent halls. Furniture was overturned, paintings were shattered, the once pristine interior becoming a scene of chaos and destruction. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Enzo gained the upper hand. He pinned Don Antonio to the ground, his arm locked around his throat, his face inches from his enemies. It's over, Antonio, Enzo said, his voice hoarse with exertion. It's finally over. Don Antonio glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance. You will never win, he spat, his voice a strangled whisper. You will never have her. Enzo's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. He could kill him, he realized. He could end it all right here, right now. He could avenge his father's death. He could finally put an end to the feud that had consumed their families for generations. But as he looked into Don Antonio's eyes, he saw not just hatred, but also pain. He saw a reflection of his own grief, his own loss, his own struggles. He saw a broken man, a man who had been consumed by darkness, but who was still, in some twisted way, Katerina's father. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill him. He couldn't become the monster he had always fought against. He released his grip, staggering back, his body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of the adrenaline surge. Don Antonio lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief. Get out, Enzo said, his voice low and menacing. Get out of my sight, and never come back. Don Antonio, slowly and painfully, got to his feet. He looked at Katerina, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions, regret, anger, and something that almost looked like love. You'll regret this, Katerina, he said, his voice hoarse. You'll regret choosing him over your own family. Then, he turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Enzo and Katerina alone in the aftermath of the battle. They stood there, staring at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The fight had changed everything. It had brought them to the brink of destruction, but it had also cleared the air. Enzo walked towards her, his steps slow and hesitant. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was electric, sending a wave of warmth through her body, despite the chilling knowledge of their true relationship. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes filled with concern. Katerina nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She leaned into his touch, seeking comfort in his presence, in the warmth of his body. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her waist, his body pressing against hers. He held her tight, as if he were afraid she would disappear. I almost killed him," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I almost became the monster I've always hated." "But you didn't," she said, her voice trembling. "You chose mercy. You chose love." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I love you, Katerina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know it's wrong, I know it's forbidden, but I can't stop loving you." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the curve of his lips. "I love you too, Enzo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I love you more than anything in the world." They kissed, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a love that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries of their family ties. It was a kiss that acknowledged the truth of their situation, the impossibility of their future, but also the undeniable power of their connection. They had faced the storm, they had survived the battle, and they had chosen love, even if it was a forbidden love, a love that might ultimately destroy them. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the two of them, together, embracing the flame of their forbidden desire. Chapter 16. Reckoning with the Past. The fragile peace that followed Don Antonio's failed attempt to kidnap Katerina was shattered by a new revelation, a discovery that forced them to confront the past in a way they had never anticipated. While searching through the documents recovered from Silvio's secret compartment, Enzo stumbled upon a faded, handwritten letter dated years before his mother's death. The letter was addressed to Lorenzo Costa, Enzo's father, and it was signed with a single initial, I. The letter spoke of a secret meeting, a rendezvous arranged between Isabella, Caterina's grandmother, and Lorenzo. Isabella had written that she had something important to tell him, something that could change everything. But the meeting had never taken place. Isabella had been murdered before she could reveal her secret. Enzo and Caterina, reading the letter together, realized that Isabella had been planning to tell Lorenzo the truth about Enzo's parentage. She had been planning to reveal that Enzo was not Antonio's son, but Lorenzo's. This revelation, while seemingly resolving the issue of their incestuous relationship, opened up a whole new can of worms. It meant that Enzo's entire life, his quest for revenge against Don Antonio, had been based on a lie. He had spent years hating a man who was not responsible for his mother's death, a man who was not his biological father. Enzo was devastated. His entire identity, his sense of purpose, had been shattered. He felt lost, adrift, his world turned upside down. Katerina, seeing his pain, tried to comfort him. She understood his confusion, his anger, his sense of betrayal. But she also saw an opportunity, a chance to finally break free from the cycle of violence and hatred that had consumed their families for generations. Enzo, she said, her voice soft but firm. This changes everything. You're not bound by the past anymore. You're not obligated to seek revenge. You can choose a different path. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, we can leave this all behind, she said. We can walk away from the feud, from the violence, from the darkness. We can start a new life, together. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. To leave behind everything they had ever known, to abandon their families, their heritage, their identities, it was a daunting prospect. But it was also liberating. Enzo hesitated, his mind wrestling with the implications of such a decision. He had spent his entire life defined by his hatred for Don Antonio, by his quest for revenge. Could he simply walk away from that? Could he forgive the past? I don't know, Katerina, he said, his voice uncertain. I don't know if I can. You can, she insisted. We can. Together. She reached out and took his hand, her touch sending a familiar warmth through his body. She looked into his eyes, her gaze filled with love and determination. "We don't have to be defined by the past," she said. "We can create our own future. A future free from violence, free from hatred, free from the sins of our fathers." Her words resonated with him, stirring something deep within his soul. He saw the truth in her words, the possibility of a different life, a life of peace, of happiness, of love. He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers. "You're right," he said, his voice firm. "We can do this. We can leave it all behind." The decision was made. They would leave the villa, they would abandon the feud, they would start a new life, together. But before they could do that, they had one final task to complete, to reveal the truth to their families, to expose the lies that had poisoned their lives for so long. It was time to finally face it. Chapter 17. A haven in the storm. Their decision to leave, to abandon the feud and start a new life, was met with resistance, disbelief, and outright hostility. Enzo's men, loyal to their leader but also bound by the code of the mafia, struggled to understand his decision. They had fought for him, bled for him, and now he was turning his back on everything they had believed in. Caterina, meanwhile, faced the wrath of her father. Don Antonio, enraged by her betrayal and by Enzo's refusal to continue the feud, vowed to hunt them down, to make them pay for their defiance. But Enzo and Caterina were resolute. They had made their choice, and they would not be swayed. They began to make preparations for their departure, secretly, discreetly, knowing that they were surrounded by enemies. They chose a remote location, a small, isolated village in the mountains, far from the reach of the mafia, far from the influence of their families. It was a place where they could be anonymous, where they could start a new life, free from the shadows of the past. One evening, as they were making their final preparations, a storm broke, a violent tempest that mirrored the turmoil within their own lives. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, the thunder roared, shaking the villa to its foundations. Enzo and Caterina found themselves huddled together in the library, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. They were both on edge, their senses heightened, knowing that the storm could provide cover for an attack, that their enemies could be lurking outside, waiting for an opportunity to strike. But despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their future, they found a strange sense of peace in each other's presence. They were together, and that was all that mattered. "Are you scared?" Enzo asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. Caterina shook her head. "Not anymore," she said. "I'm with you. That's all that matters." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that had been rare in recent weeks. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jawline. "I love you, Caterina," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I love you more than words can say." "I love you too, Enzo," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. They kissed, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of their love, of their commitment to each other, of their hope for a future free from the darkness of their past. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that reaffirmed their decision to leave, to start a new life, together. As the storm raged outside, they found a haven in each other's arms, a sanctuary from the violence and hatred that had consumed their families for generations. They held each other close, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They talked, sharing their dreams, their hopes, their fears. They spoke of the life they would build together, the children they might have, the simple joys of a life lived in peace, in anonymity. They made love, slowly, tenderly, their bodies expressing the love that their words could not. It was a union of souls, a merging of two lives that had been torn apart by the past, but were now being brought together by the promise of a new future. As the dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, a world that seemed to reflect the new beginning they were embarking on. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face challenges, that their enemies would not give up easily. But they were ready. They had each other, and they had their love. and that, they knew, was all they needed. They found their first real haven. Chapter 18. The Unraveling of Secrets. Before leaving the villa, Enzo and Caterina decided to confront their families one last time, to reveal the truth about their lineage, about the lies that had fueled the feud for generations. They knew it was a dangerous move, that it could provoke a violent reaction, but they felt it was necessary, a final act of defiance against the darkness that had consumed their lives. They sent messages to Don Antonio and to the remaining members of Enzo's inner circle, summoning them to a meeting at the villa. They didn't reveal the purpose of the meeting, only that it was of utmost importance, that it concerned the future of both families. The meeting took place in the Grand Hall, the same room where Caterina's wedding had been so dramatically interrupted. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation and suspicion. Don Antonio arrived with his men, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes filled with hatred for Enzo and Caterina. Enzo's men, confused and uncertain about their leader's intentions, stood guard, their hands hovering near their weapons. Enzo and Caterina stood together at the head of the table, facing their families, their expressions resolute, determined. They were ready to face the storm, to expose the truth, no matter the consequences. Enzo began to speak, his voice calm but firm, his words echoing through the silent hall. He told the story of Isabella and Lorenzo, of their forbidden love, of Antonio's betrayal, of Lorenzo's death. He revealed the contents of Isabella's letter, the proof that he was not Antonio's son, but Lorenzo's. The revelation was met with stunned silence, followed by a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and denial. Don Antonio roared, his face contorted in rage, accusing Enzo of fabricating the story, of trying to undermine his authority, of destroying the family. Enzo's men, meanwhile, were shocked, confused. They had believed in their leader, they had followed him blindly, and now they were being told that his entire life, his entire quest for revenge, had been based on a lie. Caterina stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. She spoke of her own journey, of her discovery of the truth, of her decision to choose love over loyalty, justice over family. She challenged her father, confronting him with his crimes, his lies, his manipulation. "You destroyed our lives, Papa," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You destroyed our families. You created this feud, this endless cycle of violence and hatred. It's time for it to end." Don Antonio, cornered and exposed, lashed out, his words venomous, his anger uncontrollable. He accused Caterina of being a traitor, a whore, of betraying her family, her blood. But his words had lost their power. The truth had been revealed, the lies exposed. His authority, his control had crumbled. Enzo's men, witnessing the confrontation, began to question their loyalties, their beliefs. They had followed Enzo out of respect, out of a belief in his cause, but now they saw that his cause had been based on a lie. One by one, they began to turn away, to distance themselves from their former leader. They had been caught in a web of deceit, of violence, and they wanted no part of it anymore. Don Antonio, seeing his power slipping away, made a final, desperate move. He drew a weapon, intending to kill Enzo, to silence him once and for all. But before he could fire, one of Enzo's men, a man who had been loyal to him for years, stepped forward and disarmed him. The man, his face filled with sadness and regret, looked at Enzo and shook his head. "It's over, Enzo," he said. "It's all over." Don Antonio, defeated and alone, was taken away, his reign of terror finally at an end. The feud, the cycle of violence and hatred, had been broken. Enzo and Caterina stood together, amidst the ruins of their family's legacy, their hands clasped tightly together. They had faced the storm, they had exposed the truth, and they had survived. They had lost everything, their families, their homes, their identities. But they had also gained something, their freedom, and they had each other. The truth was devastating. Chapter 19. The Ultimate Choice. With Don Antonio's reign of terror finally over and the truth of their lineage revealed, Enzo and Caterina stood at a crossroads. The villa, once a symbol of power and conflict, now felt like a hollow shell, echoing with the ghosts of a past they were desperate to leave behind. They had each other, their love a beacon in the darkness, but the path ahead remained uncertain. They spent their final days at the villa packing a few essential belongings, mementos of a life they were leaving behind, but also symbols of the love and resilience they had discovered within themselves. The weight of their decision pressed down on them, the gravity of abandoning everything they had ever known, but their resolve remained unshaken. As they prepared to depart, they were confronted with one final, unexpected obstacle. A small contingent of Enzo's most loyal men, those who had remained steadfast even after the revelations about his parentage, approached them. They were led by Giovanni, a grizzled veteran who had served Enzo's father and had been a mentor to Enzo himself. "We understand your decision to leave, Enzo," Giovanni said, his voice respectful but firm. "But we cannot let you go alone. The world is a dangerous place, and Don Antonio's allies are still out there. We will accompany you, protect you, until you are safely settled." Enzo was deeply moved by their loyalty, but he hesitated. He had wanted a clean break, a fresh start, unburdened by the ties of the past. He didn't want to drag these men into a life of exile, a life away from their families and their homes. "Giovanni, I appreciate your offer, but I cannot accept it," Enzo said. "This is our journey, Caterina's and mine. We must do this alone." Giovanni nodded, understanding. "As you wish, Enzo," he said. "But know this, we will always be here for you. If you ever need us, you have only to call." He extended his hand, and Enzo clasped it firmly, a silent acknowledgement of their bond, a bond that transcended the lies and betrayals of the past. With that final farewell, Enzo and Caterina set off, leaving behind the villa, the feud, the darkness that had consumed their lives for so long. They drove away in a simple, unassuming car, leaving behind the luxury and the power that had once defined them. As they drove, they talked, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future. They spoke of finding a quiet place, a peaceful haven where they could build a new life, a life free from violence, free from the expectations of their families. They decided to change their names, to shed their identities, to become someone new. They would no longer be Enzo Costa and Caterina Esposito, heirs to a legacy of violence and hatred. They would be whoever they chose to be. They arrived at the small, isolated village in the mountains, the place they had chosen as their sanctuary. It was a picturesque village, nestled amidst rolling hills and lush forests, a world away from the chaos and the violence of their former lives. They found a small, modest cottage, overlooking a tranquil valley. It was a simple dwelling, but it felt like a palace, a haven of peace and serenity. They began to build their new life, slowly, carefully. They learned the rhythms of the village, the customs of the local people. They worked hard, earning their living, contributing to the community. They found joy in the simple things, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the beauty of the natural world, the kindness of their neighbors. They discovered a sense of belonging, a sense of peace, that they had never known before. But even in this idyllic setting, they could not completely escape the past. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing that Don Antonio's allies would find them, that their newfound peace would be shattered. One evening, as they were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset, they saw a figure approaching, a figure they recognized instantly. It was Marco, Caterina's brother. They braced themselves, expecting the worst, fearing that he had come to seek revenge, to drag them back into the darkness. But Marco surprised them. He approached them cautiously, his face filled with a mixture of shame and remorse. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice trembling. "I came to ask for your forgiveness." He told them that he had been released from prison, that he had renounced his family, that he had decided to start a new life. He had learned the truth about their father, about Enzo's parentage, and he was ashamed of his past actions. Caterina and Enzo listened in silence, their hearts filled with a complex mix of emotions, surprise, relief, and a flicker of hope. Could they truly forgive him? Could they trust him? The ultimate choice was theirs. They had to go with their hearts and leave their past behind for good. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Katerina and Enzo looked at Marco, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The years of betrayal, the pain he had inflicted, couldn't be easily erased. Yet his words, his demeanor, seemed genuine. He appeared to be a changed man, haunted by the past, seeking redemption. Marco, Katerina said, her voice soft but firm, "What you did, it was unforgivable. You betrayed us. You betrayed your own family." Marco nodded, his eyes downcast. "I know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it." Enzo stepped forward, his gaze intense. "Why are you here, Marco?" he asked.
What do you want?
"I want to start over," Marco said. "I want to be a part of your lives, if you'll let me. I want to be a brother to you, Katerina, and a friend to you, Enzo." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions, with years of hurt and resentment. Katerina and Enzo exchanged a look, their eyes communicating a silent understanding. They had both been through so much. They had both learned the hard way that trust was a precious commodity, easily broken, difficult to rebuild. Katerina took a deep breath. "We can't just forget what happened, Marco," she said. "The wounds are still too fresh. But we can try. We can try to forgive, to move forward." Enzo nodded in agreement.
But it won't be easy, he said.
"You'll have to earn our trust, Marco. You'll have to prove that you've changed." Marco's face lit up with a flicker of hope. "I will," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I promise you, I will." And so, a fragile truce was formed, a tentative reconciliation. Marco stayed with them in the small village, working alongside them, helping them build their new life. He was a changed man, humbled by his past mistakes, determined to make amends. He proved to be a valuable ally, his knowledge of the mafia underworld proving useful on several occasions. He helped them navigate the dangers that still lurked, the threats that still lingered from Don Antonio's allies. But the past was not easily buried. Don Antonio, though stripped of his power and imprisoned, still had influence. He had loyal followers who were determined to seek revenge, to punish Enzo and Katerina for their defiance. One evening, as they were returning from the village, they were ambushed. A group of armed men, their faces masked, attacked them, their intent clear, to kill Enzo and Katerina, to avenge their fallen leader. A fierce firefight erupted, the peace of the quiet village shattered by the sound of gunfire. Enzo, Katerina, and Marco fought side by side, their years of training and experience coming to the fore. Marco, proving his loyalty and his courage, fought with a ferocity that surprised even Enzo. He shielded Katerina from harm, risking his own life to protect her. In the end, they managed to repel the attack, driving off their attackers. But they knew that this was not the end. Don Antonio's allies would be back. They would never stop hunting them. Enzo and Katerina realized that they could never truly be safe, that they could never truly escape the past, as long as Don Antonio was alive. They made a difficult decision, a decision that would change their lives forever. They decided to confront Don Antonio one last time. They decided to end the cycle of violence, once and for all. They planned their move carefully, knowing that they were walking into a trap, that the odds were stacked against them. But they were determined. They were ready to face their demons, to confront the man who had caused them so much pain. They traveled to the prison where Don Antonio was being held, using Marco's contacts to gain access. They confronted him in his cell, their hearts pounding in their chests, their hands trembling. The final confrontation was a reality. Epilogue. The confrontation with Don Antonio was not what they expected. They had anticipated rage, defiance, a final, desperate attempt at revenge. Instead, they found a broken man, his spirit crushed, his body weakened by illness. He was a shadow of his former self, the ruthless mafia boss reduced to a frail, pathetic figure. He looked at Enzo and Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. He knew he had lost. He knew that his reign of terror was over. I have nothing left, he said, his voice a raspy whisper. You have taken everything from me. Enzo and Katerina exchanged a look, their hearts filled with a complex mix of emotions. They had sought justice, they had sought to end the cycle of violence, but they found no satisfaction in his suffering. We didn't come here for revenge, Papa, Katerina said, her voice soft but firm. We came here for closure. We came here to end this, once and for all. Don Antonio looked at her, his eyes searching hers. You were always too good for this life, Katerina, he said. You were always meant for something more. He turned his gaze to Enzo. You are your father's son, he said. Strong, determined, honorable.
I was wrong about you.
His words were a confession, an admission of guilt, a final acknowledgement of the truth. He had spent his life consumed by hatred, by a thirst for power, and it had brought him nothing but misery and ruin. Enzo and Katerina left the prison, leaving Don Antonio to his fate. They had found no joy in his downfall, but they had found something else, a sense of peace, a sense of closure. The past was finally behind them. They returned to the small village, to their quiet life, to their newfound happiness. Marco, having proven his loyalty and his remorse, was welcomed into their lives, a brother in all but blood. They lived a simple life, far from the glamour and the violence of the mafia world. They found joy in the everyday moments, in the beauty of the natural world, in the love they shared. Years passed. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up knowing nothing of their parents' past, nothing of the feud that had once defined their lives. They raised their children in a world of peace, of love, of hope. Enzo and Katerina never forgot the past, but they did not let it define them. They had learned from their mistakes. They had forgiven those who had wronged them, and they had moved forward, creating a new legacy, a legacy of love, of resilience, of hope. They grew old together, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable. They had faced the storm, they had survived the darkness, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than ever before. They had found their happily ever after, a testament to the power of love, of forgiveness, and of the human spirit's ability to overcome even the most daunting of obstacles. They lived out the remainder of their days in peace. The end.